They believed the Bennett family would fracture quietly. They believed whatever tension had begun to circulate beneath the polished surface of their home would dissolve into polite statements and controlled smiles. They believed silence meant surrender. What they failed to understand was that silence, in the hands of a patient man, could become a strategy far more powerful than confrontation. Carter Bennett had grown up watching his father build something from almost nothing. Victor Bennett was not loud, not theatrical, not impulsive. He had built their private investment firm with steadiness and restraint, earning trust not through charisma but through discipline. At home, he carried the same composure. Decisions were deliberate. Words were measured. Emotions were not suppressed, but they were governed. That steadiness had always felt like security to Carter. Recently, it felt like distance, like a quiet recalibration taking place beneath the surface. The first shift appeared in paperwork. Board meeting minutes arrived with subtle changes in language. A clause softened here. An authority reference reframed there. Nothing dramatic enough to alarm anyone glancing quickly through the document. But Victor did not glance. He read with care. Financial summaries that once came directly to his desk were rerouted through secondary approval channels. Access permissions expanded quietly. The changes were procedural, almost invisible. Yet together, they formed a pattern. Senior partner Everett Sloan began speaking with a slightly different confidence during meetings. His tone remained respectful, even admiring, but the substance of his proposals leaned toward restructuring, modernization, redistribution of authority. Compliance Director Marissa Cole supported him with carefully worded policy revisions that appeared responsible and forward-thinking. Each memo was clean, organized, difficult to challenge without seeming resistant to progress. Lauren Bennett maintained her composed presence in every room she entered. At charity events and firm dinners, her smile remained warm and reassuring. Yet she began mentioning Victor's workload in gentle conversation, expressing thoughtful concern about how much responsibility he carried. It sounded caring. It sounded protective. Repeated often enough, it quietly planted doubt about his sustainability. Carter sensed the change before he could articulate it. Dinner conversations skimmed the surface. Strategic discussions no longer unfolded openly at home. His father spent longer hours in the study, reviewing documents beneath the steady glow of a desk lamp. There was no tension loud enough to name. No confrontation. No raised voices. But something felt off, like a subtle misalignment in a structure that had once felt unshakable. Victor did not confront Everett. He did not question Marissa publicly. He did not challenge Lauren's expressions of concern. There was no anger, no accusation, no emotional dumping. Instead, there was observation. Late at night, long after the house had gone quiet, Victor compared document versions line by line. He traced metadata. He reviewed timestamps. He duplicated critical paperwork into a secure archive. His movements were calm, methodical, almost gentle in their precision. Privately, he acknowledged what others could not see. Something feels off. The thought did not carry panic. It carried clarity. And clarity led to a decision. He would watch. He would wait. He would not react prematurely. If there was a pattern, it would reveal itself fully with time. The annual audit cycle approached, a routine external review that examined compliance and governance. Victor circled the date on his calendar without fanfare. Timing mattered more than emotion. If a restructuring effort was unfolding quietly, it would need to surface with informal review windows. Until then, documentation would be his discipline. Everett's confidence continued to grow in subtle increments. References to leadership transitions slipped into strategic planning sessions. Marissa adjusted compliance language to allow temporary delegation of executive authority under broadly defined contingencies. On paper, the shifts appeared protective. Responsible. Sensible. Lauren's composure never faltered. Her empathy remained intact. Yet the repetition of public concern about Victor's health began to echo among colleagues. Concern, when expressed gently and often enough, can prepare a room for change without ever announcing it. Carter felt the emotional weight of uncertainty but saw no visible fracture. His father offered reassurance not through explanation but through steadiness. There were no defensive speeches. No emotional appeals. Only quiet presence. It was not avoidance. It was patience. During a late quarter board session, a preliminary restructuring draft circulated. Framed as a safeguard against unforeseen incapacity, it contained a clause allowing temporary transfer of executive voting authority under specific circumstances. The language was subtle, buried within procedural revisions. Most eyes skimmed past it. Victor did not skim. He read the clause twice. Then again. The metadata showed it had been inserted recently. The authorization trail revealed approval's process during a narrow window when he had been traveling. The coordination was careful. Quiet. Intentional. He folded the document without comment and thanked the board for their diligence. His expression did not change. His tone remained even. In that room, surrounded by composed faces and measured smiles, no one saw the shift inside him. Later that night, alone in his study, Victor placed the restructuring draft into his growing archive. The evidence was no longer abstract. It was documented. Structured. Real. They believed he had accepted it. They believed silence meant concession. They did not realize that silence, for Victor Bennett, was the beginning of the long game. They believed the changes were too small to notice, too technical to question, too buried in procedure for anyone to trace. They believed authority could be redirected quietly, through polished documents and softened language, and no one would take the time to look closely. What they underestimated was not Victor Bennett's intelligence, but his patience. They mistook restraint for blindness. They forgot that the quietest man in the room often reads the most carefully. Victor did not react to the restructuring clause with anger. He reacted with order. The next morning, before the office filled with conversation and controlled smiles, he began reorganizing every shareholder agreement the firm had executed over the past decade. He laid them out chronologically, tracing the evolution of language, authority, and voting structure. Patterns begin to reveal themselves when placed side by side. He was not looking for dramatic theft. He was looking for drift. Metadata became his ally. Hidden within digital properties were timestamps that told a different story than the polished final drafts. Clauses that appeared long-standing had been edited weeks earlier. Wording that seemed procedural had been inserted during narrow windows of access. Each revision was small enough to appear harmless. Together, they formed direction. Carter noticed the shift in his father's routine. There were no speeches, no warnings about betrayal. There was only discipline. Victor stayed later at the office, reviewing archive server logs and restoring earlier document versions that had been quietly replaced. Discovery text surfaced, short internal notes attached to drafts, approval chains that rerouted through secondary accounts, edits made minutes before board packets were finalized. It was not chaos. It was coordination. Everett Sloan continued his ascent with composed confidence. His presentations remained polished. His language emphasized growth, modernization, sustainability. Marissa Cole supported him with revised compliance memoranda, citing industry best practices and governance efficiency. On the surface, it was responsible leadership. Beneath the surface, authority was consolidating. Lauren maintained her warmth in public spaces. At fundraisers and firm dinners, she stood beside Victor with unwavering composure. Yet the narrative that Victor might eventually step back continued to circulate gently through conversation. It was never stated bluntly. It was framed as foresight. Preparation. Concern. Concern can be persuasive when wrapped in grace. Victor did not challenge the narrative. He allowed it to unfold. Silence became strategic discipline rather than absence. Instead of contesting minor infractions, he documented them. Instead of correcting every procedural reinterpretation, he preserved copies. Each small deviation strengthened the timeline he was quietly building. The deeper review revealed something more substantial. Everett's name appeared in advisory correspondence linked to an external holding entity, one not disclosed during recent governance updates. The connection was not overtly illegal. It was undisclosed. Equity pathways, when mapped carefully, suggested indirect benefit from the very restructuring proposals now circulating internally. Victor did not confront Everett. He did not bring the findings to the board prematurely. He understood timing. The annual regulatory audit was approaching, a formal review that would examine structural compliance and financial transparency. If discrepancies were presented within that window, they would carry weight beyond personal accusation. Until then, documentation would continue without disruption. He retained a forensic accountant under strict confidentiality. The engagement was quiet, methodical, detached from internal firm channels. The accountant reviewed equity distributions, advisory fees, and amendment histories with clinical precision. No drama. No speculation. Only numbers and sequence. At home, Carter felt the emotional distance widen, though no hostility filled the space. His father remained calm, attentive, even gentle. There was patience in Victor's demeanor, a refusal to let suspicion turn into bitterness. Whatever this was, he would not allow it to erode his character. Guilt flickered briefly, had he missed earlier signs, but he replaced it with clarity. Acceptance of reality was more useful than self-reproach. As the forensic review deepened, evidence began aligning with Victor's instincts. Equity adjustments had been executed in phases, each small enough to avoid immediate scrutiny. Advisory structures masked influence. Compliance memos justified redistribution of temporary authority. The pattern was sophisticated, deliberate, and timed to coincide with narrative shifts about Victor's capacity. Still, he did not move. Minor policy changes continued passing through meetings. Everett spoke confidently. Marissa distributed clean memoranda. Lauren maintained her steady presence. The firm appeared stable from the outside. Stability can conceal transition. Victor finalized the archive, categorizing evidence into secure files, contract versions, metadata logs, advisory correspondence, equity tables. Each document was indexed by date and access chain. This was not revenge. It was preparation. The forensic accountant delivered a preliminary summary 2 weeks before the audit cycle. The language was careful, measured, unemotional. But the conclusion was clear. Concealed equity transfers had been routed through the external holding entity connected to Everett. The restructuring proposals, framed as modernization, aligned directly with those financial benefits. Victor read the summary slowly. There was no surge of triumph, no anger. Only confirmation. They had believed no one would follow the paper trail. They had not expected it to lead exactly where it did. They did not raise their voices. They did not argue. They did not threaten. They smiled. And sometimes, the most dangerous shifts in power happened behind the calmest expressions. By the time the paper trail had begun to reveal its quiet pattern, Everett Sloan had already moved beyond subtle adjustments. His strategy was no longer just structural, it was relational. He spent more time with junior partners, mentoring them over coffee, praising their initiative in meetings, positioning himself as the bridge between tradition and progress. He spoke about sustainability, adaptability, leadership transition, not as an accusation against Victor Bennett, but as a natural evolution. The language was inclusive. The tone was forward-looking. It was difficult to challenge without appearing resistant to growth. Marissa Cole reinforced the narrative with selective emphasis in compliance briefings. She did not fabricate information. She curated it. Risk assessments highlighted areas that required agile leadership. Governance summaries subtly suggested efficiency through redistribution of authority. The documents were clean, persuasive, impossible to fault on technical grounds. Her revisions circulated quietly before meetings, giving certain members time to absorb the framing before formal discussion began. Lauren Bennett adjusted her posture in more personal ways. At firm gatherings and charity events, she still stood beside Victor, but her conversations began to orbit around Everett's vision. She spoke warmly about modernization and the importance of preparing for the next generation of leadership. She expressed gentle concern about Victor's workload, careful never to question his capability, only his well-being. The distinction mattered. It softened resistance while planting readiness. Carter felt the shift most sharply in what was not said. Invitations to smaller strategy sessions no longer reached him. Briefings arrived after conclusions had already formed. At home, his mother's tone carried reassurance, but not transparency. His father's silence remained steady, but Carter sensed the weight behind it. Something feels off had matured into something clearer, though still unspoken. In the boardroom, smiles masked recalibration. Agendas were structured efficiently. Conversations remained courteous. Everett's proposals were presented as collaborative refinements rather than structural changes. When Victor listened without interruption, some interpreted it as concession. When he asked measured questions without accusation, others mistook it for uncertainty. Silence, in that room, began to look like absence of defense. Victor saw the alliances forming, not through confrontation, but through proximity. He observed who nodded first when Everett spoke. He noted who requested copies of Marissa's revised compliance memos ahead of meetings. He mapped voting weight carefully, reviewing not only percentages of ownership but patterns of influence. Leadership is not just authority on paper, it is trust distributed across relationships. His documentation archive continued expanding. Each circulated draft, each revised clause, each selectively framed risk summary was stored chronologically. He did not respond publicly to any single change. He allowed minor procedural shifts to pass when they strengthened the broader timeline. This was not indifference. It was discipline. The long game requires endurance more than reaction. There was no revenge language in his thoughts. No internal speech about betrayal. What surfaced instead was a quiet acceptance that structures evolve and people reveal themselves in seasons of transition. He examined his own decisions with humility, acknowledging moments he might have delegated too freely, trusted too completely. Guilt flickered briefly, then softened into clarity. Self-reproach would not protect his family or his firm. Precision would. Everett's confidence grew as resistance failed to appear. He interpreted Victor's restraint as fatigue. He interpreted silence as erosion of authority. During one late quarter session, he referenced contingency planning again, emphasizing the need for temporary leadership redistribution in unforeseen circumstances. The room responded with thoughtful nods. Marissa's prepared summary supported the argument with policy citations. Victor remained composed. He asked for copies of the revised documents. He thanked everyone for their diligence. He did not defend himself. He did not contest intent. The absence of visible pushback reinforced the assumption that transition was inevitable. But privately, the audit date had been circled weeks earlier. Timing was not accidental, it was deliberate. If structural change was to be formalized, it would intersect with external review. Authority shifted most cleanly when oversight was present. Carter watched his father with a mixture of concern and growing respect. There was no panic in Victor's posture. No tightening of voice. Only patience. In that patience was a kind of strength that did not need applause. Then, during a formal scheduling session, the announcement came calmly, almost casually. A board vote would be held to formalize amendments to executive authority under contingency provisions. The language was procedural. The tone was respectful. The smiles remained steady. The date was set. Victor glanced at the calendar, not with surprise, but with recognition. They believed the vote would confirm what silence had already conceded. They did not yet understand that silence had never meant surrender. They believed the quiet man was cornered. They believed his silence meant he was outmaneuvered, emotionally exhausted, slowly stepping aside. What they could not see was that while they were building confidence in public, he was building protection in private. And protection, when constructed with patience, becomes architecture. Victor Bennett did not rush after the board vote was scheduled. He did not call emergency meetings. He did not confront Everett Sloan or question Marissa Cole's procedural framing. He understood something essential about power: when challenged prematurely, it defends itself. When allowed to expand unchecked, it exposes its structure. And structures leave blueprints. The first step was quiet reinforcement. Victor transferred his personal voting shares into a protected trust structured under existing bylaws. It was not a dramatic move, not one that required announcement. It was legal, strategic, and rooted in long-standing contingency planning. The trust insulated his authority from temporary reassignments framed under vague incapacity language. It was a safeguard he had once considered routine. Now, it became essential. At the same time, he strengthened Carter's inheritance protections. Not as a reaction fueled by fear, but as an act of steady stewardship. He ensured that any restructuring attempt could not destabilize his son's financial future. There was a gentleness in that decision, a quiet acknowledgement that leadership was not only about preserving a firm, but preserving a legacy without bitterness. Externally, Victor retained legal counsel under strict confidentiality. The firm chosen had no prior connection to Bennett Investments, eliminating any internal leakage. He did not seek aggressive litigation. He sought clarity. Counsel reviewed the restructuring draft, the equity transfers, the metadata logs. Their assessment was measured, the actions were subtle, coordinated, and potentially problematic under regulatory review if presented with supporting documentation. Meanwhile, Everett's confidence grew. In meetings, his tone carried a calm inevitability. He referenced transition planning as though it were already agreed upon. Marissa relied on procedural technicalities, emphasizing that all revisions complied with industry standards. Her memos were airtight on the surface. Precision can conceal intention when viewed in isolation. Lauren remained unaware of the full legal counterstructure unfolding beneath the surface. She continued speaking about stability and forward momentum, unaware that the very architecture she believed was forming around Everett was being quietly reinforced elsewhere. Victor did not confront her. There was no accusation in his eyes at home. Only patience. Acceptance that people sometimes move in directions shaped by perception rather than malice. He created a comprehensive timeline linking every document revision, every access log, every approval chain. It was not dramatic reading. It was methodical. Edits to bylaws appeared 2 weeks before equity adjustments. Compliance memos circulated hours before metadata changes. Advisory correspondence connected to Everett's external holding entity aligned precisely with proposed governance shifts. Alone, each detail was defensible. Together, they told a different story. Silence deepened, not from withdrawal, but from discipline. Victor spoke less in board sessions, allowing others to fill the space. He listened to phrasing. He observed who leaned forward when contingency clauses were mentioned. No bragging. No visible preparation. Only stillness. Carter watched his father with growing understanding. There was no panic in Victor's movements. No restless pacing. Only steady action layered quietly beneath composed presence. It was a lesson Carter would carry long after the season ended: strength does not always announce itself. Sometimes it builds foundations beneath the surface. The audit window approached with quiet inevitability. External regulatory review would soon examine governance compliance and financial transparency. Victor had already initiated a pre-review inquiry through counsel, submitting documentation without triggering public notice. It was not an accusation. It was a request for clarification, structured in neutral language. Timing was precise. If the board vote proceeded without oversight, restructuring could be formalized quickly. If oversight intersected with the vote, every clause would face scrutiny. Victor intended the latter. Everett continued moving confidently, unaware of the pre-review inquiry. Marissa refined documentation for the upcoming vote, relying on the technical correctness of each individual amendment. Lauren prepared for public reassurance once transition language became official. The narrative felt settled. The momentum felt unstoppable. Then, quietly, a response arrived from regulatory authorities. The pre-review documentation had raised sufficient concern to warrant readiness for formal examination upon submission of a complete filing. The language was measured, procedural, but unmistakable. If formally filed within the audit window, the matter would trigger immediate review. Victor read the notice without visible reaction. No satisfaction. No triumph. Only confirmation that patience had weight. He closed the folder gently and placed it beside the secured archive. The architecture was complete. The foundation reinforced. The timing aligned. They believed the vote would seal his removal. They had no idea the window they chose would be the one that opened everything. They thought it was over. They thought the transition was already decided, that the quiet founder would step aside gracefully while they inherited the structure he built. They smiled with confidence because they believed the outcome belonged to them. What they did not realize was that control feels strongest right before it slips. Everett Sloan carried himself differently now. His posture in meetings held the ease of someone who believed the room had already chosen him. He spoke about continuity with subtle authority, referring to future initiatives as though he were already guiding them. His tone remained respectful toward Victor, but beneath it ran an assumption of inevitability. The restructuring vote had been scheduled. The narrative had been softened. Momentum, from the outside, seemed irreversible. Marissa Cole finalized the compliance memorandum supporting the proposed governance adjustments. The document was thorough, citing precedent, regulatory alignment, and risk mitigation strategy. Every clause appeared reasonable when read independently. She took pride in its precision. Procedure, after all, rarely raises suspicion when dressed in professionalism. Lauren Bennett reinforced the modernization narrative in social spaces. At fundraisers and firm dinners, she spoke about evolution and sustainability, about preparing the firm for the next generation. She never spoke against Victor. She spoke about readiness. The community began to accept the idea that he might be transitioning voluntarily, stepping back with dignity. Concern had quietly matured into expectation. Carter felt the tension sharpen in ways that could not be measured on paper. Conversations at home were gentle but distant. His father remained steady, attentive, almost unusually calm. There was no anger in him, no bitterness. Only focus. Carter sensed that something decisive was approaching, though he did not yet know its form. Victor Bennett, meanwhile, was completing his work in silence. The evidence packet he assembled was not emotional. It was not accusatory. It was precise. Shareholder agreements arranged chronologically. Metadata logs highlighting edit patterns. Advisory correspondence linking Everett to the external holding entity. Equity transfer summaries mapped alongside restructuring proposals. Each document told a fragment of the same story. Together, they formed clarity. He did not warn anyone. He did not hint at his intentions. There was no confrontation in the boardroom, no attempt to argue his case publicly before timing aligned. He understood that premature exposure would allow defense to reorganize. The long game required stillness until the exact moment action carried weight. The audit window approached rapidly. External oversight would soon review governance integrity. Victor had already secured regulatory readiness through confidential peer review. Now, the activation depended on timing. Everett believed the firm was preparing to celebrate transition. Junior partners spoke openly about fresh leadership energy. Marissa refined presentation slides for the upcoming vote. Lauren coordinated a post-meeting gathering intended to mark what she believed would be a smooth evolution. Control, in that moment, felt absolute. Victor spent the evening before the vote in his study, not with anger, but with reflection. He considered the years invested in building trust. He acknowledged his own missteps, moments when delegation had blurred into vulnerability. Guilt surfaced briefly, not toward Everett or Marissa, but toward himself for not noticing sooner. Yet grace followed quickly. Leadership is not perfection, it is responsibility when imperfection surfaces. Carter passed the study door and paused. His father's posture was upright, composed, illuminated by the soft glow of a desk lamp. There was no visible strain. Only quiet resolve. Carter felt something shift within himself, a recognition that strength is often patient rather than loud. On the morning of the vote, the firm moved with rehearsed calm. Smiles circulated. Agendas were distributed. Everett's confidence remained measured but unmistakable. Marissa's compliance memo had already been shared with board members for review. Lauren's expression reflected assurance. Victor arrived early, greeting colleagues with the same steady warmth he always had. There was no trace of urgency in his demeanor. He carried a slim leather portfolio, no thicker than any other meeting file. The illusion of control held firm in the room. Hours before the vote was set to begin, Victor stepped into his private office and placed a sealed filing into overnight regulatory submission. The documentation was complete, indexed, and supported by forensic analysis. It did not accuse with emotion. It requested review with evidence. The submission triggered immediate formal oversight under the audit window provisions. Victor returned to the boardroom without announcement. He took his seat. He listened as Everett began outlining the restructuring proposal. The language was confident. The slides were polished. The room appeared aligned. Then notifications began appearing on secure devices, formal acknowledgement of regulatory review initiation. Confusion flickered across faces that had moments earlier been composed. The illusion fractured not with shouting, but with silence. Victor did not smile. He did not gloat. He did not explain. He simply folded his hands and waited. They had believed the vote would finalize his removal. They never imagined he had already moved first. They expected a confrontation. They expected anger, raised voices, accusations thrown across polished tables. What they did not expect was process. What they did not expect was accountability arriving quietly, without spectacle, without vengeance, without a single dramatic word spoken. The audit window had opened exactly as Victor Bennett had anticipated. Regulatory acknowledgement of his filing triggered formal review procedures before the board vote could proceed. External investigators arrived not with urgency, but with authority. Their presence was calm, procedural, and undeniable. Corporate servers were mirrored for independent analysis. Financial records were subpoenaed in accordance with compliance standards. Every action was documented with neutral language and clinical precision. The boardroom, once filled with confidence, shifted into a different kind of silence. Not the strategic stillness Victor had cultivated, but the stunned quiet of realization. Everett Sloane's composure faltered for the first time, not because he was confronted publicly, but because the process had moved beyond his influence. The illusion of inevitability dissolved into administrative fact. Marissa Cole responded as she always had, through procedure. She referenced compliance frameworks, highlighted policy alignment, and maintained that all governance adjustments had been properly documented. Her defense was technical, structured, rational. But documentation has weight when examined in sequence rather than isolation. What once appeared harmless when separated now formed a coordinated pattern when aligned chronologically. Victor did not speak more than necessary. He did not narrate the evidence. He allowed the investigators to follow the trail independently. Contracts were reviewed side by side with metadata logs. Advisory correspondence connected Everett to the external holding entity. Equity transfers were mapped against restructuring proposals. Each document supported the next without emotional emphasis. Lauren sat composed, though the gravity of unfolding events began settling across her expression. Her signatures appeared repeatedly on expanded authorization forms, each approved during phases of equity redistribution. None of the signatures alone suggested wrongdoing. Together, they demonstrated awareness of structural change at critical moments. Victor did not look at her with accusation. There was no bitterness in his posture. Only acceptance that truth unfolds on its own timeline. Carter watched quietly from the edge of unfolding history. The strength he had seen in his father's restraint now revealed its purpose. There was no humiliation campaign. No leaked statements to the press. No attempt to control narrative through outrage. Victor had not sought revenge. He had sought clarity. Everett's confidence receded as investigators traced the connection between his advisory communications and the external holding entity benefiting from equity shifts. He attempted measured explanations, framing the relationship as strategic diversification. But the chronological presentation told a clearer story than any defense could soften. When restructuring language mirrored equity advantage, coincidence became improbable. Public concern began shifting direction. Board members who once nodded in quiet agreement now requested clarification. Junior partners who had aligned themselves with Everett's modernization narrative asked procedural questions they had previously overlooked. The atmosphere did not erupt. It recalibrated. Marissa's technical defense grew narrower as evidence layered around it. Her compliance memoranda had not been false. They had been selective. Investigators noted how risk summaries emphasized certain efficiencies while omitting potential conflicts of interest. The pattern suggested intention, even if carefully disguised. Through it all, Victor remained steady. No gloating. No triumph. He did not interrupt explanations. He did not correct others publicly. He allowed process to work. There was something redemptive in that restraint, a quiet demonstration that justice does not require spectacle to be powerful. The review extended across several days. Files were examined in secure rooms. Equity tables recalculated. Email chains restored from archives. Carter noticed how his father's posture never shifted toward aggression. Even now, when truth began surfacing, Victor carried patience rather than satisfaction. Guilt, perhaps, flickered within him for having trusted too easily. But grace overrode it. Trust is not weakness, misuse of trust is. Then investigators uncovered something deeper. Buried within archived communications were earlier drafts of restructuring proposals, versions that predated the current initiative and targeted other senior executives before Victor. Those drafts had been quietly abandoned when conditions were not favorable. The pattern extended further back than anyone had assumed. The room absorbed the implications slowly. This had not been a singular strategic adjustment. It had been a recurring effort, waiting for the right timing and the right narrative. Everett's composure finally thinned into uncertainty. Marissa's technical language grew quieter. Lauren lowered her gaze, understanding the breadth of what had unfolded. Victor did not speak. He did not need to. Accountability had arrived without noise, and its clarity was louder than any accusation. But as investigators compiled their findings, a deeper question began forming: how many other attempts had gone unnoticed before this one? They thought exposure would explode. They expected scandal, outrage, headlines tearing through reputation like wildfire. What they did not expect was something slower and far more devastating, the truth unfolding on its own, without anyone needing to shout. The suspension notice for Everett Sloan arrived formally, written in careful legal language that carried no emotion. Pending investigation. Temporary removal of authority. Administrative leave. The words were clean, procedural, irreversible in tone. There was no dramatic announcement, no gathering of employees for explanation. The firm released a brief internal statement affirming commitment to transparency and cooperation. It was measured. Calm. Final. Marissa Cole followed days later, placed under ethics review for selective compliance interpretation and non-disclosure of potential conflicts of interest. Her memoranda, once admired for precision, were now scrutinized for omission. She did not argue publicly. She submitted documentation. She retained counsel. The process moved forward without spectacle. Inside the Bennett home, the silence felt different now. Not strategic. Not anticipatory. It was reflective. Victor and Lauren sat across from one another in their study one evening, the compiled documentation resting between them. There were no raised voices. No accusations hurled in anger. Only the quiet weight of facts. Lauren read through the timeline slowly, revisions, approvals, signatures. Her own name appeared repeatedly, not in wrongdoing but in participation. She had believed she was supporting modernization. She had trusted the framing. She had mistaken repetition of concern for responsibility. Guilt surfaced in her expression before words ever formed. Victor did not interrupt. He did not punish her with silence. He allowed space for recognition to settle naturally. Betrayal, in their case, had not been malicious intent. It had been misalignment, ambition reframed as foresight, concern reshaped into narrative. The fracture in their marriage did not erupt. It widened quietly, like a crack that had long existed beneath polished flooring. They agreed to step back from one another with dignity, to allow clarity rather than resentment to define what followed. Divorce was discussed without bitterness. It was not revenge. It was consequence. Carter learned the full truth not through emotional confession but through structured files. Victor showed him the documentation calmly, explaining each sequence without exaggeration. There was no attempt to vilify Everett or Marissa. There was no condemnation of Lauren. Only chronology. Cause and effect. Carter listened, absorbing not just the facts but the method. He saw how silence had not been weakness, but discipline. How patience had created room for justice to unfold cleanly. Within the firm, governance reforms were implemented swiftly. Oversight committees were strengthened. Conflict of interest disclosures expanded. Voting thresholds adjusted to prevent unilateral procedural shifts. The culture recalibrated gradually, not through fear, but through awareness. Junior partners who had aligned themselves too quickly reflected on their choices. Reputation did not collapse. It evolved. There were no victory speeches from Victor. He declined interview requests. He did not attend social gatherings to retell the story. He returned to work with the same steady demeanor he had always carried. Justice, when procedural and documented, requires no performance. Public concern shifted naturally. Conversations that once speculated about Victor's fatigue now questioned Everett's judgment. The narrative corrected itself without orchestration. Silence had allowed truth to breathe. Yet just as calm began settling across the firm, a final detail surfaced during extended review. Months earlier, during the earliest phases of equity redistribution, an undisclosed asset maneuver had been executed, one not directly tied to Everett's holding entity, but adjacent to it. The transfer was subtle, masked within advisory realignment. It had not altered majority control, but it represented intent that predated even the recent restructuring proposal. The discovery did not reignite chaos. It deepened understanding. This had never been a spontaneous strategy. It had been patient positioning, waiting for the right narrative to support it. Victor read the supplemental finding with the same composure he had carried from the beginning. No anger. No vindication. Only acknowledgement that truth often reveals itself layer by layer. He placed the final report into his secured archive, the folder now thicker than it had been months before. Carter stood beside him, recognizing that the real inheritance he was receiving was not authority, but perspective. Silence had not prevented fracture. It had prevented destruction. But as the final asset maneuver was traced further back, one question remained unresolved: who else had known about it before the investigation began? They thought he would collapse under the weight of it. They thought the investigation, the exposure, the quiet unraveling of alliances would exhaust him. They believed that once the structure shook, the man at its center would finally bend. What they never understood was this: Victor Bennett had never been fighting to win. He had been fighting to protect. And protection does not break easily. The final undisclosed asset maneuver was neutralized without announcement. Months before the restructuring vote had ever been scheduled, Victor had placed layered safeguards within the firm's operating agreement, contingency provisions designed not for conflict, but for uncertainty. Those protections, once seen as overly cautious, now closed the final gap. The maneuver, traced and documented, dissolved under regulatory scrutiny because it lacked proper disclosure alignment. It did not require outrage to undo it. It required structure. There were no dramatic confrontations. No late-night confessions filled with accusation. The resolution unfolded administratively, exactly as the accountability had. Everett's involvement moved through formal consequence. Marissa's professional standing followed procedural review. The firm issued updated governance policies that emphasized transparency, voting integrity, and independent compliance oversight. What had once been vulnerable became reinforced. At home, the deeper reckoning was more intimate. Victor and Lauren chose to separate quietly. The decision was not framed as punishment. It was framed as acceptance. Trust, once strained, does not always shatter, sometimes it simply changes shape. Their conversations were steady, reflective, even tender in moments. There was acknowledgement of misjudgment, of narratives embraced too quickly, of assumptions made without malice. Guilt surfaced on both sides, Victor for trusting without verifying sooner, Lauren for believing in progress without examining motive. Grace followed. Blame would not rebuild what had shifted. Acceptance would. The divorce was filed privately. No statements were released. No public narrative was offered. The community, once so invested in speculation, found little to analyze. Dignity can be disarming. Carter stepped gradually into leadership, not as a sudden successor but as a prepared steward. Victor involved him in governance reform meetings, compliance restructuring, and cultural recalibration within the firm. The lessons were not delivered as lectures. They were demonstrated through action. Carter observed how his father refused to speak ill of Everett even after exposure. He noticed how Victor described Marissa's decisions as misjudgments rather than malice. Strength, Carter realized, was not about humiliation. It was about boundaries. Silence, once misunderstood, had revealed its meaning. It had not been surrender. It had been discipline. Documentation, once dismissed as caution, had proven to be protection. Timing, once invisible, had revealed itself as power. Victor reflected often during quiet evenings in his study, the same desk lamp casting a familiar glow across neatly arranged files. He did not dwell on betrayal. He examined growth. He understood now that leadership is tested not when loyalty is obvious, but when loyalty is complicated. Forgiveness did not mean reconciliation. It meant refusing to let resentment become the final chapter. The firm stabilized under transparent oversight. Junior partners recalibrated their understanding of influence and integrity. Governance reforms created clearer lines of accountability. Reputation, once shaken, settled into something more authentic than before. It was not flawless. It was honest. Carter began leading strategic sessions with steady confidence. He carried forward not only operational knowledge but perspective shaped by watching his father endure without theatrics. Employees sensed the cultural shift. There was less performance, more clarity. Less assumption, more documentation. Victor stepped back gradually, not pushed, not displaced, but intentional. He remained present as advisor, not as shield. The structure no longer depended on his vigilance alone. That was the true legacy. In the quiet aftermath, there were no celebrations. No speeches commemorating resilience. Only continuity. The firm opened its doors each morning. Clients arrived. Decisions were made. Life moved forward. And yet something had changed irrevocably. Silence was no longer misunderstood within those walls. It was respected. Victor closed the final archive folder one evening and locked the cabinet gently. Not out of secrecy, but completion. He stood for a moment, reflecting not on the betrayal that had threatened his family, but on the patience that had preserved it. They had believed he would break quietly. They believed silence meant surrender. They forgot that silence, when guided by patience and integrity, can become the most strategic force of all.